Hey everybody, and welcome to Bible Study That Doesn't Suck. This is Pastor Megan Rourke, Grace Lutheran in San Francisco, where we worship every Sunday online and in person at 10:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time at www.gracesf.com. Click on any of the pictures and you'll get to the blog where the live stream is. Ta-da.
Good morning, hello, good evening, whatever it is that you are tuning in to watch this video. I'm Pastor Amanda Zanzalo. I serve at Central Lutheran Church in Northeast Portland, Oregon, and our service is at 10:15 a.m. each and every Sunday morning with communion. Join us and check us out at www.centralportland.org.
Yeah, that. I don't have to preach this Sunday. Woohoo! Because instead, I'm walking a marathon and a half to raise money for breast cancer. I'll put a link down here if you want to support that. Or if you follow my Facebook or Twitter page over Saturday and Sunday, you can check out pictures of me looking sweaty and gross. I'll try to post pictures where I'm not as gross. But you got to have a couple of gross pictures, otherwise people don't think you really walked that long.
It's a marathon. It's a marathon and a half marathon.
39 miles. Stupid. Oy vey. We're going to do it, though. It's going to be awesome. All right. Let's see. Oh, cool thing that happened last week. I was at the ordination of Asher O'Callahan at the House for All Sinners and Saints. There's a link down here about it if you want to read about awesome transgender pastor being ordained in Colorado.
Congratulations, Asher. Awesome work. Way to go. Welcome to the ordained life.
You'll know what that means in a couple of years. Second Samuel. Second Samuel's one of the first readings. Some people might choose to do Amos. I like the Second Samuel reading because it's all about carrying the Ark of the Covenant around. And for those who don't know what the Ark of the Covenant is, Amanda, do you want to tell them?
I think that there should be a link down here for people to take a look at it.
Yeah. Okay. So Ark of the Covenant is like this box on long sticks, right? So have you ever seen in a movie where like a queen gets carried by people? So it's a platform that looks kind of like that, but instead they think that all of the things that are the holiest of holy are inside that box. Maybe God's inside the box. Depends on your old-timey Hebrew theology. Inside the box is a bunch of gold, so it's really heavy. And inside the box is the 10 Commandments, even heavier, right? So there is some really cool verses about the Ark of the Covenant and how they carried it, because it's estimated to be something like crazy, like 700 pounds or something like that. But it was supposed to be super light and super easy to move around. There's a very cool episode of Secrets of the Bible Science or something like that on the Ark of the Covenant, and I will write myself a note to remember to try to put a link to that about how they might have used really smart math to make it not heavy and to get it around in easier ways. Bible Science. It's very cool. But one of the things that I think is very interesting about this idea of the Ark of the Covenant, it kind of goes along with some of the Ezekiel readings that I talked about last week. This idea that early in old-timey ancient Hebrew thought or Jewish thought, they believed that God's location on the cosmos was fixed. It was right here. You couldn't move it. And so you could get a ladder and climb up to God. You could build a tower and get to God. And then Ezekiel has this dream that God is on wheels with flame shooters, which I like to think of as one of those old people scooters that God rides around. And that way, you can't just climb up and overthrow God like king of the mountain or king of the cloud, however you imagine this being. That God isn't stuck like a statue and can't move, but God moves around. And so the people who were trying to overthrow and have wars couldn't kill your God while they killed all of the people in your community. So the idea was that God is bigger than wars, and we don't figure out who the most important God is based on who wins the war, because that's what they used to have happen. They would say, oh, well, we won the war, and that means our God's cooler than your God, and so now our God is alive and your God is dead. So this is another part of that narrative, that God is mobile and can't be conquered. The interesting thing I like about this text is that we kind of carry the burden of moving God around in the world, which would be a really good evangelism sermon, like how God, in this scenario, the way that God moves to get out of danger is we have to lift God up and walk and get God to the place of safety, that God goes with us. And that we do the burden of the lifting. The opposite is our theology of the cross, right? That God does the heavy lifting for us and does saving for us and make sure that we're all in good relationship. But this is going a long lengths to keep the things of God holy. It reminds me of the times when, remember when the White House was burning down a long time ago? And yeah, no, it happened. And then the president's wife had to run in and save all of the fancy portraits before the place, I think it was Dolly Madison, so that they wouldn't get destroyed. And so she saved them because they were the thing that was most important to her. So you can imagine, if your church burned down, which has happened to a lot of churches recently, what are the things you would run back in for and save because they represent the spirituality of your space? In 1993, maybe 1995, St. Paul's Lutheran burned down in San Francisco, and the firefighters, there's these amazing photos of firefighters climbing to the top of the steeple and saving the steeple. And St. Paul's, all the rest of it burned down and needed to be destroyed. But as they continue to work decades later to try to rebuild their building, everywhere where they have housed their church, they carry the steeple with them in their procession. And so that was the one thing that got saved from that space. And I invite you to think this week, what would you save if the church was burning down? Would the most important thing be the pastor's books? No. Although at St. Paul's, the pastor had miraculously moved his entire library out of the building a couple weeks before the church burned down. Mysterious, right? Would you want to save the art? Would you want to save the church records, right? The baptismal records? Would you want to save the baptismal font? What is it that you would save? And think about it like this Ark of the Covenant. If it still weighed 700 pounds and you had to carry it everywhere you went for the rest of your life, what would you save? And if they put that much work into carrying it around, why don't we have the 10 Commandments in some museum somewhere? Who stopped carrying it around? That's what I want to know. I don't know. I'm going to pause for Pastor Amanda to show us the lovely pooch.
So this is, we are dog sitting, and so this is another pastor's kid. This is Henry Dog, Rich Dog. Oh no, I'm Henry. So, yes, I'm Henry. Henry is a puggle and is very sweet and very cute and actually sits on my lap. Unlike the other pastor's kid who is raising ruckus back behind me with my pastor's kid. Izzy and Otson are kind of carbon, pun intended, carbon black pit bull mixes, carbon copies of each other. And they're having a little bit too much fun behind me. So. And
a lot of people, if their home was on fire, would go back in regardless of the danger to save their pets. So pets are one of the things on the list that people would kind of go to any great length to kind of save and take care of. Although this guy looks like they might or might not be able to get around themselves.
Well, these ones could, but it depends. I mean, the pet that I went back into the house fire for when I was a teenager, she ended up, the fireman got her safely out, and she was hiding under my bed. She was a cat, and she was hiding underneath my bed. So sometimes you can't get back into them when they are in the fire, and they can't see their way out because there's too much smoke.
Yeah.
So those kinds of things happen. But I think the Ark of the Covenant is interesting, and it it's interesting because it predates the temple. So the concept of the Ark of the Covenant is before they built this temple to create the space to house God. And in our scripture, and please correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it's not necessarily God's idea to have a temple built for a stationary place for people to come to God. God is totally cool with the Ark of the Covenant, which is mobile and moves and stays, something that can be in the world and of the world and around in the world, as opposed to this big fancy schmancy temple where the Ark of the Covenant is then put into the Holy of Holies and separated from the majority of the people, so that only the highest of priests could go in and be near the Ark of the Covenant. So the request to be able to do that, to separate the space where God resides from the people of God, didn't come from God's suggestion. That came from the people of God. And God said, fine, if that's what you really need to do, go ahead. So that image of God being within and amongst us and our responsibility to carry in the world, it's kind of important. And in a time and an age where not just we're seeing, right now, specifically, we're seeing black churches burning for a multitude, perhaps, of reasons that have yet to be proven, but are easy to guess at right now in our current climate. We also have many, many churches around our country who are holding on by subsidies, by endowments, and who have very, very small attendance populations and worshiping congregations, who are staying on because they have these endowments that allow them to stay on as buildings and as places where people go to find them. That would be my canine child. Henry, you can stay here. No, okay, never mind. So the buildings that we have become increasingly images and ways in which we are containing God, and ways in which we, as a people and a church, not just our denomination, but I think denominations across the country, we go to God on Sundays in this building, and then we go into the world. And those two things can be separated pretty easily because we don't see how they necessarily connect, what we do on Sunday morning in the church building with our day-to-day work lives. And at the same time, there is a growing movement that we be more and more present with our faith in the world. That we understand that being a Christian in the world is a part of being out in the world, and a part of kind of carrying that ark in our own self in some way. Am I making any sense at all?
Yeah, you make sense to me.
Okay.
I just needed some chocolate.
Chocolate!
And so I stole some chocolate. But I'm doing it biblically because one of my favorite things about this 2 Samuel text, if you've ever checked out a book called I think it's called the Queer Exegesis of the Hebrew Bible, I'll put a link, is that this text is one of the texts that reminds us to pay attention to our bodies and that we get to enjoy yummy food. It's a sensual text, not just in the sexuality way, but in the way that we enjoy what happens with our bodies and what is going on in our world. So if you look at the end of the reading, where David, after the Ark of the Covenant is secure and is all taken care of, and then after David fulfills the burnt offering rituals that were needed to be done for religious reasons, then David feeds everyone. And doesn't just feed them, how do I say this in a nice way? Stale communion wafers from a long, long time ago, or whatever gross desert food you might imagine, right? So he's been carrying this 700-pound thing all over Tyration, and still, instead of just feeding people, probably someone else cooked it, right? He's the king. Somebody else cooked it, but it wasn't like boring blah mush that just came together. It's very different than what happens in Exodus, where they gather up the manna, the dew, mushy bread-like substance that they complain about being so gross. David feeds them cakes and meat and cakes with raisins in it, right? You didn't have to put the raisins in it, but that gave it the extra touch. Imagine it like Cinnabons. It wasn't Cinnabons at all, but imagine it that way, because it's not just feeding people their daily bread. It's feeding people daily bread that tastes yummy sauce, whatever that yummy sauce is to you, right? And so it's a reminder that God doesn't just want us to give the bare minimum to those who are hungry, which I think is really, really awesome, that God wants us to enjoy our taste palates. Like maybe this is one of the first written times that there were foodies in the world, like where they were like, oh yes, and when I put these special raisins in the cake, it's just mwah, or whatever.
Make it moist and have that bite and that deliciousness.
Yeah.
Doggies want them.
So enjoy some chocolate, enjoy your favorite food, because for King David, if we are to see this story, and I don't know if it pans out anywhere, as David having a bedtime ritual. Does anyone else have a bedtime ritual where you do this thing and then you do this thing and then you do this thing and then you read a book and then you have sleepy time? Then David's bedtime ritual is stop carrying the 700-pound thing, do some dancing before the Lord, which is cool, right? Do some dancing, listen to some trumpets, some light jazz, do some burnt offerings, give people awesome raisin cakes, go send them home, right? That's a pretty awesome ritual. So have a chocolate. Or whatever your thing is.
Really good, hot, even though it's hot right now, but it's still cool enough this morning to drink it. Really delightfully delicious tea.
Or a puppy.
Yummy food. Anything you want to give me, I will eat it all.
You said I could have treats. You said the treat word. You said treats.
Don't worry, he can't hear it.
Yeah, so maybe David was training people with treats to behave.
Well,
does that work in a congregation?
Signaling approval with a little looky love. And he can't even hear it.
On Sunday, it was last week the gospel reading. Well, a bunch of the readings were about how people are ungrateful and so like stubborn and insolent, which if you can preach about that on a Sunday and you have a large congregation, sometimes you can get away with pointing out some of the stuff you want them to work on, right? And it's like, ha ha ha, you're right. We all do this thing and we're going to work on it. But when you have a tiny congregation, I had like maybe 7 people in the pew, to say you guys are insolent and stubborn and we should work on this thing just seems like you're being mean to like a couple people who came to church. So instead of preaching anything about what the congregation needed to work on, I had found a book that morning of letters that dogs had written to God in our book nook out front, because I remember that when we see that a dog is misbehaving, we don't take it as personally as when it's a family member or when it's a friend. Like, we don't assume the dog has malicious intent. We can scold them and give them lectures and it's all going to be fine, right? It doesn't mean we're mad forever. And we don't seem to have the same sort of weird emotional hangups about reforming and taking care of ourselves. We just think, I'll give you a treat. You'll be better next time. And so the letters from dogs were really, really quite great. And one of my favorite that I had read was a letter from a dog who said, I really like to be scratched behind my ears. Who scratches you behind your ears, God? So I leave you with that question for the day.
For the hungry.
Do you want to talk about Ephesians?
Let's look at Ephesians.
Ephesians
1, 3 through 14.
Whoa. That means Amanda hasn't read it yet and she's just reading things out loud. Is that true, Amanda?
It is not true. I have looked at it. So, one really cool thing that comes to mind automatically is that my best friend is currently in Turkey right now and will be going to Ephesus in the next couple of days. So that is pretty awesome.
Yay, friend!
Yay, friend! have you been to Ephesus?
I've been to Turkey, but I only went to Istanbul. At the time that I was in Turkey was when ISIS was taking people hostage there.
That's neat.
Which we'll talk about later when we get to the beheading of John the Baptist.
Well, there we go. Mm-hmm.
Wah, wah.
Yeah, this is not an easy Sunday for preaching. I'm a little jealous of your 39 miles.
Yeah.
Walk 39 miles, preach John the Baptist's beheading.
39 miles. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting text. So it's a squeamish one if you are a justice-centered progressive type like Amanda and I tend to be. This whole idea of bloody, bloody, bloody Jesus coming to save us tends to not be our favorite theme song. Once when I was on a homeless retreat, I went to a church service that was designed to make homeless people feel like their problems were the reason that Jesus was bloody, and the longer they had addiction and mental health issues, the longer and bloodier Jesus's time on the cross would be. It was a good time. And then they literally sang a song that was like, the blood on his hands, blood on his feet, because of all the things I do. Like, it was that. It was barfy. Okay. So I have to give you the caveat that I am grateful that Jesus's life, death, and resurrection means that I get a get out of hell free card, right? That I am free from sin, that I can know with 100% certainty that God is reconciled to me. Yay, that happened. Had I been given a choice in the matter 2,000 years ago, I would have perhaps suggested something less bloody and yucky. So I am grateful but bitter about the choice that was made because of the consequences that have happened when people say, well, Jesus's death was so bloody that you have to do whatever I say from now on, because if you don't appreciate what Jesus did for you on the cross. And then people come up with whatever set of rules are in fashion at that moment to tell you is what you have to do. Not everyone does that, but I've had people do that in such yucky, barfy ways that it makes me see texts that are really relying on the bloodiness of the cross through strange light, particularly because in the gospel descriptions of the cross, only one of them mentions blood, and it's the Gospel of Matthew, and it's when they're cutting Jesus's side to see if he's like dead yet. I'm just saying, he dies so quick they have to poke him to make sure he's dead. Yeah. Blood, bloody, bloody, yucky. Ugh. How do you feel? How do you feel about redemption?
How do you feel about redemption?
How do you feel about Jesus on the cross? Bloody, bloody, Amanda.
So the other piece of that, this kind of stuff that I want to talk about is not just the bloody, bloody, bloody.
Bloody, bloody, bloody altogether. Getting off the subject.
I think that it's when I went to Nicaragua, it meant so much for people to know that their Savior had experienced pain, physical pain, and emotional and mental pain.
Yeah.
Right. Because of the pain that they were in, and liberation theology, that God understands the pain that we had. I have personally not ever been whipped. I have not personally ever been caned. So I don't need my Savior to have experienced those kinds of bloody, painful things, because I have not experienced them. But I do want my God to have experienced the betrayal of friends. And I do want my God to have had a heartbreak. And to understand what chronic pain is. So, I mean, because of my privilege, I haven't had to experience the kind of bloody things that others may have. And so, you can see places where the bloody, bloody really does get a lot of play. And I try to look at it within culture. I think that when we use it in order to control other people, it's exactly the reverse of its intention. Mm-hmm. And so I don't support that theology, and I don't support the use of it in that manner, because I think that it's meant for people to know they're not alone in pain, not that they are evil in their pain and need to be fixed. So there's where I go with the bloody, bloody stuff. This is also an interesting passage with conversation about adoption. And I know that we've had this conversation historically with other passages where Paul is writing about being adopted into the family of Christ and being adopted. You know, he destined us for adoption as his children through Jesus Christ. So this idea that God really has wanted us to be God's own children. And the way that God is choosing to adopt us is through this act of Christ. So I think there's just some interesting pieces with adoption here and blood and bloodline. And in adoption, there is not shared blood. And yet there is a call and a connection that is deeper than blood, because there's choice involved. God's choice is to choose us. And at the same time, I think that it's really, for children who have been adopted, I have heard many who have said that, yes, I get that you think it makes it better to hear that, well, your parents chose you, and your parents have chosen to be your parents. It didn't just happen to them. And that's supposed to suddenly make adoption feel all better. But for the parent, I think that's really how it feels. Let me tell the children. Maybe. Hold on.
I have crying babies below me at the infant care center, so we're I have crying babies at the infant care center below me, so we both have children of discontent at the moment. Do 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 do. Thank you for waiting patiently. An operator will get back to you shortly.
So, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So this idea that for the adoptive parents, that there's certainly like, we fought for you, we worked really hard, we went through the ringer to try and adopt you. We wanted you, we chose you, we worked really hard against all odds to bring you into our life and have made a commitment, and that is a huge emotional connection for the parents. And for the child, I have heard that it is much more multivalent than that. Like, yeah, you chose me, but my parents who biologically created me didn't choose me. So those kinds of pieces that walk along that adoption path, I think that whenever this comes up in our scripture, whenever we have these conversations about God choosing us and God choosing to call us into family relationship with God through Christ, and saying that this is the way in which I am claiming you and I paid for you and I worked really, really hard for you to adopt the whole world into understanding that I am their creator and I love them with choice and with a great love, that we are the children. And I think there's a multivalent approach back of saying, right, we get that, but I don't like the way you paid for me, or your payment wasn't quite enough, or I'm really not worthy of all that love that you have said that you chose for me, because I'm eternally broken, right? You got me from somewhere broken, and I'm not good enough to be loved like that, so screw you. I'm not going to participate in this family.
Yeah.
So there's...
Who would ever say that? Teenagers.
Right. well, I think it's more than just teenagers. I think that adults say that too, and we say it in relationships of choice. And so it's always much more complex than what we want to say at the beginning. So, and at the same time, we have in this scripture, verse 13, in him you also, when you had heard the word of truth, the gospel of your salvation, and had believed in him, were marked with the seal of the promised Holy Spirit. Right? So this is language of baptism. This is language of claiming. This is language of promise and water and word. And how do we interact with the divine claiming of us? Not through genetic blood, but through a bloodline that is theological. And how do how do we reconcile that with our own understanding of faith and family? It's interesting. It's very hard to preach. And
it's especially hard to preach because of what the gospel reading is.
Right?
To try to say that the text is about anything other than pointing to bloody, bloody, bloody is super hard on let's cut off the guy's head Sunday.
You could talk about step-parent relationships, but right, because Herod is a step-parent here.
I suppose.
But it's really tough because I think one of the tough pieces on this is that you don't know. 90% of the time, people don't come out the gate and talking to you by saying, yeah, I was adopted, or, I've adopted a child. That's not information that you're going to get from your visitors. So if you have visitors in your pews, you don't know what you're triggering when you start talking about adoption and step-parenting and kind of dynamic family relationships like this.
And sometimes I think, though, like, this same dilemma of trying to find the like tiny little pearl inside of the mucky ocean is kind of what's happening in the Bible, that the old-timey people who were telling these stories out loud to each other were borrowing from the bloody, bloody stories around them. Like our creation story was this story of Tiamat, a goddess whose body is ripped in half and the blood makes the entire creation of the world, which would be a very fun blockbuster movie to go to if it was on the big screen. And this retelling of that story by God shaping us out of mud and God performing a surgery to divide this androgynous being into a male Adam and a female Eve is a toned down version of much, much bloodier stories. And the ways that stories of people are borrowed from each other, like the genealogy of Saul being used to tell the story of David, whom they wanted to show was much more important in legacy. But so you just take the cooler, bloodier, awesome story of Saul and you just give it to David, because then you'll know that David is more important. And this borrowing and swapping of stories is a really interesting thing. If you saw any of the big screen adaptions, like the Noah one is my favorite. My council president got me a copy of this movie because in the big screen adaptation of Noah, if you haven't seen it yet, there are rock people. And the rock people can talk, and they're these huge monsters, right? So we've added CGI, cool, bloody, beat 'em up, shoot 'em up parts to all of our stories, and that's just a part of, I guess, what we have to do to get people to show up and watch the Noah movie. Amanda says no, but it's an interesting.
I'll be honest, I have not seen it. I rarely engage in mega blockbuster religious films.
As is true for me. That's why my council president had to get it for me and say, watch this, it's ridiculous. And because I think that's a part of how we tell and retell stories, is we add bits and we make them bloodier and we make them more interesting. And John the Baptist, yeah, he was pushing buttons and politically having a difficult time, but we need an entire Sunday where the reading's focus is his head on a plate? Really? Yeah, it's a good story, but what the hell? Good news? Come on.
It's more than a good story, though. I mean, it's formative.
It's more than a good story. There's an important moral lesson deep in the middle of the plate.
I don't know what I'm going to be saying yet. I haven't figured this out yet. I mean, how do you preach this, right? But
I mean, the historical purpose of this story is that John the Baptist was much more popular than Jesus. No one knows who the heck this Jesus guy is. Jesus' own brother James is way more popular than Jesus and has a larger following than Jesus. And so you've got to tell stories about the people who were more popular at the time as a way to be like, oh, he was down with John the Baptist? Well, that makes him kind of awesome in my book. Like, they already knew John the Baptist. They could stick him with someone who had some street cred, and the story of John the Baptist gives Jesus some street cred. The way it's told in the Gospel of Mark is very interesting because it makes it sound like Jesus is as cool and as rebellious, and they totally would have killed him right away, except for Jesus, hid in the desert until it wasn't scary anymore, which is fascinating, fascinating, fascinating. If you want to tell a story about a powerful political force that in the very first chapter begins with this person cowering in the desert until the danger's gone and then coming out to heal people. It's fascinating. So I think in the scheme of Mark's gospel, yes, Jesus ends in a very difficult, politically suffering way, right? So meets the same kind of end. And they kind of, Mark's gospel, I think, is trying to say that Jesus maybe was more upsetting to political figures because they had to have a trial, and John didn't get a trial, just cut his head off at a whim because, you know, some kid wanted his head cut off and the wife wanted the head cut off, right? Like, so it wasn't the same kind of political get rid of this guy. And so it makes it seem like Jesus's death is a bigger deal, that it has to have a public display. So I don't know. I don't know if this part of the story is simply about making people understand the importance of Jesus, if it's simply about attaching Jesus's name to someone who was cooler and had more street cred, or if this is like one of those moments where Mark was like, okay, you've stopped listening. I'm 6 chapters in, pay attention. You're going to listen when I tell you about the head on a plate, right? And it's true. And if you have to tell this story out loud all the way from the beginning to the end, which I've had to do in a class where we had to memorize the entire Gospel of Mark and tell it, about the 6th chapter, people get a little bleary-eyed. And so I can see how adding a story of a dude's head on a plate is going to get you to pay attention. And I imagine that people who were maybe dozing off during the worship service, when they hear about John the Baptist's head on a plate, might listen more to the sermon than they already would have because, yay, sermons. Maybe they make it through the whole sermon without sleeping because it involves blood and guts and heads. But it's hard to know. Very, very hard to know. Just saying.
When I look at this passage, I see so much fascinating family system dynamic going on. It's just this kind of messed up family situation. There's a man in power who's married his brother's wife, and there's a prophet who's saying that wasn't the right thing to do, and there's a young girl who pleased Herod and his guests, and he's got a whole bunch of people around, and he promises to give anything that she asks,
but it's kind of creepy, right? Because the daughter dances and he's so pleased by her dancing that he gives her anything she wants. That's a creepy stepdad story. Creepy stepdad story.
Very creepy in front of the guests, right? And so, and what's really creepy is, you know, she goes out. His daughter is Herodias, and Herodias goes out to her mom and says, "What should I ask for?" And the mom comes back with the head of John the Baptist. And right, and so that's what the mom asks for. And so, but what Herodias comes back in with, this young woman, she comes back with, I want you to give me the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Like, she totally like ups it one, you know, in a great way. So, and he doesn't, you know, the verse says the king was deeply grieved. Like, he doesn't want to do this because he doesn't know what to do with John the Baptist yet. But he has to go through with this because he's made this public promise to this girl in front of all these guests. And so he'd be losing face, he'd be losing honor if he doesn't follow through. So it's this strange story of feminine power.
Well, it's also the thing that happens in Mark's gospel that doesn't happen in all of the other gospels is the king refuses. and it's the other people around him that go and kill John the Baptist and bring him back. They follow through with the wish, but the king refuses. So it mimics a little bit more the way Jesus goes out, right? Where Pontius Pilate is like, I don't think this dude should die, but then everyone else goes along with it anyway. So it's an interesting, I mean, I don't know. He goes from creepy stepdad to like compassionate and thinking that's a dumb request. Maybe that's just the most unattractive thing. If you ever want your creepy stepdad to stop ogling you, give them a really weird response to what you want, like something really sadistic.
Well, but
What you should do is tell someone and you should get help. And even if they don't listen to you, you should report it. That's what you should actually do in that kind of circumstance. Go ahead.
yeah, no, it's very strange because, Herodias, you're being told that Herodias is his brother's wife, but then farther down, his daughter Herodias comes in to dance, so there's strange things of these women not having their own names, but just the feminized version of his name, and it's just family dynamics are messed up in this family, and
yeah,
we know that Herod was pretty messed up. I mean, historically, we have, kind of words about Herod that he was a pretty messed up dude. So it's a pretty messed up situation. And Herod.
I was wrong, by the way. He does order the death in this version.
He orders the death. He's deeply grieved, right? So you at least get in this one that he doesn't just do it straight out the gate without.
But does that make you feel better? Like when you hear that when the presidents are torturing people in like prison camps, that they feel bad about it? Does it make you feel better that they did it?
I don't know, does it?
I did this unjust thing, but I feel so bad.
What I think is interesting here is that he allows his oath and the pressure of the guests to force his hand into action.
Right.
It's not because he thinks it's going to save X amount of lives or for the greater good, right? That it's not for that purpose or that reason. The reason why Herod kills him is because of he made a promise to a girl, and he wasn't going to take it back. Which is
he didn't want to look dumb. Peer pressure.
It's peer pressure, and that's just strange.
It reminds me. I mean, it's not about heads getting cut off, but it reminds me of the conversation that's happening about taking the Confederate flag down. And I've been following Bree Newsom's Twitter feed, and she's an incredibly smart lady, the woman who planned the nonviolent protest to climb up and take the flag down. And her intent was not to injure the flag. They even took it down in a way that would like keep it safe, and they didn't do anything bad to it. They handed it back, and then it gets put back up the flagpole. And she's very smart on Twitter of talking about the ways that privilege and the desire of people in power to keep their place and to keep other people put in their place is a part of what is so really deeply difficult to untangle. And this seems like a story that's getting towards that. It's a king who's in the most privileged of privileged positions, who has the ability to choose to do something compassionate or to choose to do things the same old way that they've always been done, and to pass on violence and kind of be as unjust as you could come up with. Like just cutting someone's head off because you liked the way someone danced is the equivalent of the most unjust we can imagine people being. And Herod chooses not to deviate from that, to maintain the power that he has and to be a part of this club of people who make decisions and don't think about how it affects people who have less privilege than them. And so I think that's an interesting layer to the conversation. I think it's a tricky dance, but we can also talk about ISIS here, because the videos online of them chopping people's heads off is done in order to be so brutal and so unjust that it requires a response. And I think that same reaction is what we can have to this Mark story. Mark's all about, at the end of this story, I want you to get some shit done. Like, I want you to like do something. You know,
Yeah.
it's like sitting through the movie V for Vendetta and then going home and taking a nap, right? It's just kind of a ridiculous response to what a movie that's all about getting you to finally do something to make your world better. That this story is to provoke us. If you're not going to be affected by the most unjust thing that we can come up with to put in a story, then what the heck is going to get you to try to bring justice into the world? And so it's an interesting thing right now, because we don't know how to respond to ISIS, right? Because if we say that they're powerful and scary and that we should respond to them, then we've legitimized them and given them a place in the world. And if we ignore the brutal and barbaric things that are happening, then we're participating in the injustice that's happening in the world. And so what the heck do we do? And aside from allowing and ignoring when political leaders use unjust means to try to stop that kind of barbarism, it's really hard to know, what can I do sitting here in my office at Grace Lutheran Church to stop ISIS, which is super far away, from beheading people, right? I have no idea how to do that. I know how to give people raisin cakes, right? I know how to grow things and to use less water in our congregation in the midst of a drought. I know how to go to the Social Security office in my clergy collar and shame someone into supporting someone who deeply needs services. I know how to write in sarcastic ways or in thought-provoking ways that can get me lots of Twitter followers. I do not know how to get ISIS to stop cutting people's heads off. I don't. And I feel super hopeless, and I feel super helpless about it. And I feel like I can't even talk about it because it might, like, I might say things in the wrong ways and make people wonder if I'm against all people of certain kinds of faith. And that's not true, because those faiths are a part of my family. And so when's the last time you heard a Bible study on people being beheaded in ISIS and you thought, oh, I feel so much better now, right? And I wonder if what Mark is getting to in this story is unimaginable things happen. We don't know how to respond to them, but thank God that Jesus comes to the world and reconciles this. So we need to do those things that we can do. We need to give people raisin cakes, and we need to, save our water, and we need to do our part. That is this, and we need to yearn and pray and fight and stomp and kick and scream until God helps us or provides us with the ability to reshape those in authority and those political leaders who can make a difference and do know how to find ways to stop beheadings from happening. And so, I don't know, but I like that this story gives me the opportunity to talk about something I feel like I can't talk about, and that is woefully depressing. And I don't want anyone else to be beheaded. So there you have it. I'm glad that in my trips through the Middle East that I wasn't kidnapped by ISIS, and that I didn't have to be worried about that during my time there. That would have been so scary. But I hope your friend stays really safe in Turkey.
Yeah. Well, and the other piece, I think, is looking at the context of when the Gospel of Mark was written, and understanding the persecutions and these kinds of events were going on, were happening. And the desert was a place where some folks did run away to. And there were huge conversations about if in the early church, after the Gospel of Mark was written, but huge conversations about, well, I stayed through the persecutions in town, and therefore I'm the better Christian. You ran away and hid, so you aren't welcome back into the fold. You can attend, but you can't take communion.
Yes. And that conversation happens in Mark's gospel as well. Sorry, Amanda, you just froze, so I'm going to talk for a little bit. There is a portion of Mark's gospel called the desolating sacrilege. Oh, now you're back.
Am I back?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. I was talking about the desolating sacrilege and the section of Mark's gospel where this older conversation, it's older than Jesus's time, but it filters into the Gospel of Mark. There's a section about, do you see those stones? Do you see those buildings? They will all be torn down. And it talks about when you see a desolating sacrilege, that you are to flee. So Mark's instruction in this conversation that Amanda's talking about between do you flee or do you stay and get slaughtered, Mark's advice coming from Jesus's mouth is when the desolating sacrilege come, you are to flee. Get the heck out of there and save yourselves. Sorry, what were you saying, Amanda?
Just that it was a really huge conversation, and I think it lasted for hundreds of years.
Yes.
And it was one of those kinds of things where we take a look at our Christian history and we kind of gloss over the fact that one person.
Do. Poor Amanda. We miss you, Amanda. All right. Goodness gracious. Well, I'm sure Amanda's in the process of saying very exciting things while she is frozen on my screen. Hopefully we don't end up talking. Oh, you're back.
Yay!
Now you're back.
Can you hear me now?
I hope that it's not actually playing and I just don't hear you. But I think because I have the main screen that you're probably not talking when you freeze, right?
Yeah, probably not.
Sorry about that. Amanda was saying geniusly awesome things about how it's not only about John the Baptist, it's about a lot of people. I'm sure that's what you're saying.
And the early church, and that that people who had the accepted Orthodox, which is to say just accepted, Orthodox meaning like this is the accepted way we believe, that in the year 200, the Orthodox belief of the church, 200 years later was heretical, right? So things changed and didn't stay the same from 100 years to 200 years to 300 years to 500 years later. And some of the most, the heated conversation in the first 100 years would have been, can you be a person of faith and be a Gentile, or do you have to be a Jew, right? We see that in Paul's writings. Some of the contested pieces of faith in 2 to 300 were, can you be a Christian if you don't believe in the Trinity? Mm-hmm. Right, these kinds of conversations. As the persecutions continued, it was, can you be a part of the Christian faith if you ran away from the persecution? Or were you a greater person of faith if you were beaten and maintained your faith? What if you were beaten and said that you were not a person of faith? Could you apologize for that and be welcomed back into the fold? So these kinds of horrific events that John the Baptist experienced of having his head cut off and that are happening currently in modern day world as people are persecuted for their Christian faith in the Middle East, these kinds of events are what created our theology and the early church, right? I mean, it's trying to figure out who's at.
Happy beheadings and such.
So not happy clappy. It's so a part of our faith, though.
I know, but it's so like, it's so
hard, and we are so separated from it in the United States, especially in the white United States, where we have not necessarily, where many of us have lived in a place of privilege that makes it such that we have not experienced these things.
And our understanding of Jesus is Jesus in the hot air balloon.
Jesus in the hot air balloon. So, I have no idea what I'm on Sunday, but I have a really cute dog in my lap.
Mm-hmm. Maybe you can borrow my book on, you should borrow my book on letters from to God.
Letters from dogs to God. Okay, let's see if what the other dogs are doing.
Yeah. Ooh, hi, dog.
Peek around the side. That's Watson the puppy. Hello, Watson the puppy. And there's the old lady Izzy, who's just waiting for Watson to come back and play a little more.
Pretty good.
A brief respite for a few short moments.
poor those. That's what it looks like when older dogs are tired out by a puppy who won't leave them alone. That's how my congregation feels. I'm the puppy.
You're the puppy. Yeah. And if you want to know what a tired person looks like, who's been kept awake all night by a puppy. Hi. All right. So I think that's enough.
Yeah.
Thank you, folks.
I mean, what more can you say after a whole topic of beheadings?
Right. What do you say? What do you say?
All right. Well, we'll love y'all. We'll see you next week. Take good care. Bye.
Puppies say bye.
Bye.